What's happening, everybody? I'm so excited to drop this special edition of the Technically Speaking podcast. And it's for a special occasion because today is my birthday, January 10th, 2024. Another year in the books, another year around the sun. Hopefully getting wiser and aging slower by the day. Today, we'll be diving into the fascinating story of the rise and fall of Envision. Back in November, Miro had acquired Envision's freehand tool. On the first week of January, the CEO of Envision announced that by the end of 2024, that Envision would shut down services for the prototyping tool that we grew to love over the years. In this episode, Jay Demetillo, design strategist, educator, consultant, joins me all the way from Melbourne, Australia. I think he hopped on a call at around 3 a.m. his time, and we had a really good time just kind of reminiscing and going through the history of Envision and discussing the impact that it had.
One of the things was like it flipped user testing on a different level.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because like you could just show it to anybody on a desktop screen and eventually mobile, where they finally got mobile right, where like you could get real-time feedback, and it was amazing. So instead of just waiting for like a tech link from your developers, you can now share this Envision link instead of just going to your like sketch file and just like showing a user, hey, tell me about this flow, right? It just changed everything, and it was so nice. It was really nice.
So in the show, we'll kind of explore the evolution of design tools from prototyping with real code to designing red lines in Photoshop, and the emergence of Sketch that optimized for designing UIs. We'll go through some of the challenges that designers face and the joy that collaborative work brought at the time, right? I think nowadays it's kind of an expected thing in the world of Google Docs, Figma, right? Multiplayer is kind of ubiquitous now, but it really wasn't. Envision really brought that to light. So get ready for an insightful and thought-provoking discussion packed with personal anecdotes and insights. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we did. A lot of the numbers and the sizing that you'll hear in this episode have come from Crunchbase. So that's kind of where, as we start to go through the timeline, sit back and enjoy. What's happening, technically speaking? I've got my man Jay on the call, and where are you at? You're in Australia, right?
Yeah, I'm in Australia right now, which is pretty wild. I'm in Melbourne, to be specific.
Nice. I feel like it's always like, where is Jay? Because you've been to like the Bay Area twice since the last time that I've seen you. And our schedules haven't exactly lined up in the best way possible. But I must say, like, for the fact that you live like halfway across the world, it's just amazing just how close in contact we are. Always great to see and hear from you. And bro, you've been on a world tour. What's happening? What's going on?
Yeah, I got really lucky this year. I didn't expect to be on doing all these talks, and they were just agreements from previous conversations from last year.
Yeah.
I was in Vancouver, then I guess I did an amazing job. Then I went to Toronto, same conference, organizers in general. And then I went to the Philippines.
Yeah.
And then, did one in Tokyo.
Wow. That's amazing. Yeah, I always say it's amazing just like where design can take you, right? Outside of obviously like the pixel part of it, but maybe give listeners a little bit of background in terms of what has your talk track been. I actually just had a recording with Fonz Morris. I know you all met in the Philippines, and he's doing his thing too, like in terms of traveling and talking. And what's top of mind for you when you're in these spaces?
Oh my gosh. It first started off with talking about inclusion and DEI, which is getting crap on right now for really poor reasons. And I think for me, it's just really important to just the first talk in the beginning of the year was more about how do you design and be inclusive for your users.
Yeah,
But now it's changed into designing for or bring value to design through the business and understanding your stakeholders. So it's very like high level and something that you
sure.
probably have to deal with of convincing people of like why it's valuable to hire a designer or even why this has to be nicely designed for our users in general, but also being inclusive to our stakeholders and using the same language. And people don't realize how important that is. And I know some people, especially in Southeast Asia, are a little bit confused by the concept, but
Yeah,
I know it's obviously been hitting a lot of the right buttons with some people. So that's probably the most important part.
yeah. That's dope. Hopefully, listeners can have an opportunity to check out some of those talks. Are any of them publicly available?
The one in the Philippines is not yet, but I think that's
Yeah.
the one that everyone should probably check out because I made people cry again. So,
Oh, my man. Wow. So it's like an emotional type of thing.
oh yeah, Fonz called me, and I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say this, but he called me the Malcolm X of Filipinos, which is hilarious.
Interesting.
Go
I,
look for it.
yeah. I was going to say, folks have to listen to it themselves and make the judgment there, but we'll take the anecdote. We'll take it. We'll take it. Look, let's get into it. I'm super excited about our episode today because it's a little bit different format than listeners are used to. Normally we go through the Q&A, but it'll be a discussion. And we're both obviously design practitioners. We've been in the industry for quite some time. We've seen it from multiple different angles, but we're going to be talking about the rise and fall, if you will, of InVision. And for listeners that aren't familiar, and just to even just set a level set with folks, is InVision at one point was really a disruptive design tool on the market, right? Like a lot of folks today, we talk about InVision, or excuse me, we talk about Figma. Some folks talk about XD, but I don't really think that's the case. Some folks have also, they might still work with Sketch. And so InVision at one point, we thought was going to run away with it. And so we'll get into the reasons why. And maybe we can start and create like the timeline here. InVision was started in 2011. And if we think about like the timeline, like Figma was actually started a year later, but Figma didn't really catch on because their whole premise was
No,
multiplayer and it was browser based. And so
that's
that
right.
really wasn't a need for the market at that point in time. Most studios, because there were a lot of studios back then, and then teams started moving in house, but most folks are working out of Photoshop at that point, right? What was your kind of stack back then?
Oh my gosh. Photoshop, remember Dreamweaver when that was
Oh yeah.
around? That was still
Yeah.
like being used, dude. Like it
Yeah.
was crazy. What else? Like I would use Illustrator because have to create like a lot of pixel stuff as well,
Yeah.
like on top of like iconography and
Yeah.
whatnot. But there wasn't really like a good program in
No.
general for UX.
Yeah. And on top of that, I always remember this was like when I was transitioning into product design, UX, right? And Photoshop was like the de facto because it could do it, right? You might use Illustrator, but the pixel was always off, right? It was always like a half
Yeah.
a pixel off. And this was like at a time too when, I think like Android they were doing like pixel density, right?
Yeah, dude.
And then we were just getting into responsive stuff. So there was nothing like really focused on product design. And
There
so
wasn't.
that like it was crazy. Like you're talking about Dreamweaver. I still remember like my first role, I was coding for prototypes. So it was like you launch like these like kernels or whatever. You mean you're literally in terminal and you're launching like these JavaScript programs to create a simulation or an environment. And then I was literally like, fortunately, I knew how to code, but I found myself like at that point so frustrated, dude, because I was literally building prototypes and bug bashing half the time.
Yeah,
It
that
was
was
crazy.
rough, man.
Yeah.
And also remember like when Flash was a thing and
Oh,
before like Apple took away all the Flash script
yeah.
from everything.
Yeah.
A lot of things were built on there, on web specifically, but it looked like crap on mobile,
Yep.
because no one really considered mobile back in the day, right? And
No.
until Apple made the iPhone.
Yeah. Yeah. So the iPhone was a huge like game changer. And again, like I think like I was designing for iPhone, I was designing for Android and Windows Phone.
That's
So
right.
that was crazy.
Mm,
Design systems weren't really a thing at that point. I think Twitter. So obviously people now associate
yeah.
with X. Twitter was actually leading industry wise in terms of like design systems because they had their Twitter design language that you could look at, you could see the documentation. And so this predates, it doesn't predate obviously like Apple human design guidelines, but human design guidelines before almost was like a manifesto. So you could
That's
interpret it
right.
in so many different ways. And this was also pre material design. And so a lot of people were looking at like Twitter for design system inspiration, which is super crazy to think about that now.
And it's weird because if you think about it, Twitter did start like design Twitter literally started back then because
Yeah.
everyone was documenting what they were using. And that's
Yeah.
how I found out about like certain programs like InVision and whatnot or Figma or whatever. Because it was like all over Twitter. I was like, what is this thing? And
Yeah.
if you remember, Twitter was like the place to go. Like the nerdy kids would go to find
Yeah.
things in general.
The hashtags,
That's
the
right.
back
That's
channel.
right.
So one of the things that disrupted the whole Photoshop and Illustrator workflow was Sketch. And I know you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but Sketch basically ended up becoming like the de facto product design tool because it wasn't a situation when you opened up where you had this open canvas and you had to put in the dimensions. It actually already had those things in place, right? So you would choose like your iPhone, what was it, iPhone 4 versus
Yeah.
an iPhone
Oh my God.
5
It was
versus
the first
like,
time we saw that too. Our minds
yeah,
are blown, right? What?
I know. So that in my opinion really started to, it brought a new layer of just like efficiency because also you weren't saving these huge Photoshop files.
No. They're huge ass sketch files.
They're huge sketch files, correct, exactly. But do you remember, I know we went through this for a little bit with Sketch, but, like, when you were designing with Photoshop, remember you would save, like, the date that you would save the file,
Oh,
and
dude,
you'd put that file in
so
that
bad.
date? Yeah, and everyone had a different, like, you go from one org to another, every company had a totally different file structure.
Oh, dude, yeah. Like Apple had their own design structure, but it's funny because if you worked with ex-Apple people, they'd
Yeah,
have the similar file structure in their Photoshop or even like Sketch if they use Sketch. It was like wild. Like they would
yeah,
name their layers, they have dates, and that was like crazy. I was like, what? There's like a whole function to this?
yeah,
I didn't realize there was like a whole different level to it.
yeah. That reminds me. That's like when the layer conversation started to really
That's right.
take off, right? Because
Yeah.
Sketch, I think you had the different kind of, actually, no, you had basically the storyboard. Same thing like with Figma. And Sketch had a very Illustrator, like it took from Adobe Illustrator, right? If you think about the format.
Yeah.
And but then on the left side, you had all of the layers, which is similar now in Figma. I think it's standard for a lot of programs now. But
Yeah.
when you start working with larger teams, which was the case, people get really anal about their layers.
Oh, dude. They Yeah, I remember everybody would make memes, and it's still a meme to this day about naming layers, especially on Figma. And it's fascinating because the layers weren't they're important, but I guess when you think about it, the question was, how do we get these to the engineers? It was like the
Exactly.
biggest thing, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So when you talk about red lines, so that's like where the origination of red. I don't think red
That's right.
lines are the exact same anymore, but you
No.
would literally have to create another file and then basically call out like the
Yeah.
pixels. Um, it's really interesting because I feel like that was very tedious work. And I know
Yeah.
designers these days don't really have to think about those as much, but I actually thought that was a very, how would you say that? What's the word for it?
Discipline.
It created a discipline. It's
Yeah,
like one of those things where you look like for me, like I can look at something and be like, yo, that's 16 pixels. No, that's off.
that's right. That's
Right.
right.
And I think it's important to establish all of these things, like bringing back all these memories. Um, because I think the engineering piece was really difficult. And like for me, like personally, the company I was working at, we had engineers in Poland.
My
And so
gosh.
I was always up against the clock to get things to them because if I didn't, that was like 2 days of work that were lost.
That's right.
And
Dude,
I didn't even know these guys like that because I hadn't even flown out there. I don't know. We're
and they
just
may not even
keyboard
speak
warriors.
English. Like, how do they
Yeah.
understand, like, your, thinking on the layouts? Is it, like, pixels? Can they look at that? Do you have to make something for them to understand that? It's so hard back then.
Yeah. And whatever you delivered had to be on point. There was no margin for error.
Yeah, it was a little bit, what do you call it? What's the word? It was very it was just very difficult, and there was no room for error
Yeah.
because whatever you delivered was gonna get built, and it was on you if you messed up, right?
I know. I know. I feel like you skipped over the word margin for error. I was like, man, is it
Dude.
really that kind of trauma? Right. That you just
Dude, I
blink
was so
margin out?
traumatized because I remember, like, marking out, like, a giant sketch sheet and,
Yeah.
like, having all the padding and the red lines, and then I would realize, "Oh, they need, like, different screen sizes for, like, older Android devices, and I don't have that
Yeah.
in my spec sheet," and I was freaking out.
Yeah. The Android thing was so difficult, dude. Because you were doing it for each and individual device, right? And they
Oh, dude,
kept rolling
it
out
was
with
so
device.
bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was so annoying,
It was a
but thank
lot.
God for Zeppelin. Thank God
Yeah.
for Zeppelin, though, when that came
Yeah.
around, right?
Yeah. So that stack there was Sketch and then Zeppelin. And Zeppelin was amazing. It was
Yeah,
actually, we didn't have anything better. And so I think with Zeppelin, you'd integrate that. And instead of having to actually create the red lines, they could actually see a version of your file and hover over it. But it wasn't perfect either because
no.
you had to group things a certain way. And that kind of changed like how folks like built their work. And so when we talk about layers, that was even another kind of issue with that.
Oh, man, and then plus it's like a different app. I didn't understand for the longest time why Sketch just didn't buy them out.
I
That
know.
probably would have helped elevate them to
No,
Envision and Figma status, right?
I
I
know.
don't understand.
I know. The funny thing is, obviously, I'm skipping in the timeline, but I think Sketch for the most part still like a very small studio. Like I think the two
That's right.
original founders like still work on it. So I just don't think that was a part of like their ethos.
Oh, man, I have so many questions, like, how are they still making money?
Yeah. Zeppelin was the same way. I think they
Yeah,
were, because I remember talking with their team when it came out because they're doing like user research. And so
yeah,
since I was managing the team and approving our rec for that, I talked to them. I talked to InVision. So it was amazing how accessible those teams were. But now let's actually get into it because we've been building this up a lot. So Envision comes on the scene. Obviously, we talk about them being started in 2011, but 2014, 2015 is probably when most folks really started to use them and catch on. And the big thing with Envision is that now your stuff went to the cloud. And
so
not only
nice.
did it go to the cloud, you could actually comment on those things in the cloud. And so when we talk about red lines, yes, like some of that work still happened, and it really depend. I think people are trying new things, right? And then actually, I think at one point, Envision kind of actually built in some of that, but it wasn't fully complete. It wasn't all the way there.
Yeah,
But I'm trying to think. So number one, it started to share. So that was great. So crazy file systems were turning into a thing of the past. Sharing on like in the cloud allowed for feedback when you're not at work, which is great. So asynchronous feedback. We talk about this a lot. We take it for granted
yeah.
now, but that unlocked that door. And yeah, I think it also
Presenting the
I think it
prototype, right?
yeah, you had the prototyping. And so no more coding prototypes. There are a gazillion different prototyping tools out there. I think Framer was one of the first ones back then, and that was a code-based
Yeah.
one at that time. And since then, they've just pivoted into creating websites. Framer was like a huge tool for people doing interaction design. Man, that helped out a lot. What was like your reaction when you first used InVision?
Oh, dude. I think one of the things was like what we didn't mention was like it flipped user testing on a different
Mm,
level,
yeah.
right?
Yep.
Because you could just show it to anybody on a desktop screen and eventually mobile, where they finally got mobile right, where you could get real-time feedback and it was amazing. So instead of just waiting for like a tech link from your developers, you can now share this InVision link instead of just going to your like sketch file and just like showing a user like, hey, tell me about this flow. It
Yeah.
just changed everything. And it was
Yeah.
so nice. It was
Yeah.
really nice.
It was huge, right? Like I remember with our developers, because we went through the rec and we were like, yo, this is a lot of money. We went through with finance and all that. And our developers are like, this is like an invaluable tool. We'll spend whatever. And that's how
Yeah.
transformative the tool was. In 2014, 2015, Figma starts to catch like wind in 2016. Um, but no one's really paying attention to it even then, right? Because it's still about we're just catching on. There's a ton of value.
Yeah.
There's no need for multiplayer. And I think a big part of that is like a lot of design teams were now just at a point where we see what other designers were doing. We didn't necessarily have a need
Ah,
to
that's true.
dig into their files. And even then, like it was still an individual sport, if you will, because everyone had their own instance of Sketch
Yeah. Or Envision, right?
or Envision. Correct. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Until they figured out the collaboration thing, which
Yeah,
came later as well. So yeah.
exactly. Exactly. So, like, this is the interesting part when we talk about like how crazy it was. Like, Envision had a really great marketing machine. So, if you look
Oh,
back at
dude,
all their
yeah.
press, Fast Company, they're in Forbes all the time. I think one thing that stood out was that they were one of the first companies that was fully remote. And you talk to a salesperson that might be in Australia or Texas. I think they were founded in New York. That's where the founders were. But they were really the first company to do remote, full remote before anybody, right? Again, it's one of those things where we take that for granted nowadays.
Oh,
Um,
dude, yeah. And to add to that, I think they were probably one of the companies that were actually part of the design community. Like back
yeah,
then, right? Remember like during SF Design Week, like
yeah,
you'd see Envision sponsored by Envision everywhere.
exactly.
And they were part of the community. Like you felt like they like cared.
They exactly. I think this was like a really interesting like turning point. I don't think any of us really thought too much about. Envision had a crazy marketing machine. And I think I'm glad you brought that up because like they were actually producing movies.
Yep.
So
Design
I think
disruptors.
they
Yep.
had Design Disruptors. I went to that premiere, like it was in the Castro. They had a full like red carpet. And I think the thing about that is that we got to, for what it's worth, folks got to see their design heroes on screen. And it really
But
kind of,
yeah, there were issues with that.
I
If you
mean,
remember, there was an uproar. There was just all Caucasian designers. If
yes.
you remember,
Yeah,
that was the issue.
exactly.
I was like, where are the people of color guys? And
Yeah.
more women. There were only like two women
Yep.
in general. I was like, what's going on here?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, that was yeah, now that you bring that up, I remember that. And so there was that piece. Then they started their design podcast. I think my times might be getting mixed up, but I know that they did release a podcast. So they released the
They
Design
did.
Better podcast. They did a bunch of stuff. If I tell you, you're going to be surprised. In total, their total funding was 356.2 million. 10 rounds of funding. I'm assuming they probably started out on their own because their first round of funding was actually debt financing. And so debt financing basically is when you go to a bank, get a loan, and you say you'll pay it off over a certain period of time. Obviously, in terms of like their growth, that really wasn't an issue. Um, but I think what's really interesting is in 2020, basically they did secondary market financing, which basically is when a company will buy back from investors, right? Buy back those assets. Really crazy to think about that because I'm going to go through the updates, right? So basically you had InVision, which was like the workspace where it would upload to Sketch, or Sketch would upload to the cloud. You could do
Yep.
all the comments, ton of value there. Then in 2017, they introduced Craft, was
That's right.
also amazing
Yes.
because what it ended up doing, it ended up automating the upload process, right? So you didn't have to
Oh my
go to
God, it's
Sketch and
incredible.
look at your files, right?
Yeah.
So it's like you click a button in Sketch and it would automatically upload your updates, which was huge, especially considering the files were a little bit larger. Then that's where it introduced freehand. And so freehand is, at that point in time, it was pretty bare bones, but it was basically a canvas to work on things collaboratively. Think about early version of
It's,
Miro, which we'll get to later.
it was Miro, pretty much.
Yeah, basically Miro. No one really used freehand though, which is like
That's
really
right.
interesting. Then it had data. So that was when we started getting into, like, you talked about user testing. So that's when we could actually start bringing in actual data, right? So bringing in text, bringing in images, JSON, live web content. So like news articles. So that was really great. Like I remember
Yeah.
doing some tutorials online with the team and doing those types. And it was like, yo, this is crazy. We can actually bring in non-static information. It was still static, but it opened up a lot more possibilities and made things real. And then I don't know if you remember this, they had the design system manager.
Yeah, I do remember that. That was
Yeah.
amazing. Also,
Yeah. Like for what it's worth, you think about anytime we get these new tools, there's like this proliferation of like different startups. And so I don't know if you remember, there were a ton of design system startups that integrated in InVision and
so many.
integrated it into Sketch. And then eventually they integrated into Figma, and ultimately Figma started creating more of these foundational things. But we're not talking about Figma right now.
Yeah.
But 2017, again, it was like, wow, this is really starting to ramp up. And then ultimately, they started to create their own tool called InVision Studio. And InVision Studio was supposed to be a direct competitor to Sketch. And it incorporated a concept of multiplayer. So they were definitely, they had their ear to the ground in terms of what was happening with the likes of Figma. What was your experience with InVision Studio? Did you ever try that out?
Oh, dude, I did, but this is the thing that probably did envision in. I think the pricing back in the day, and
Yeah.
feel free to chime in, especially if you're like obviously running a team, is like the pricing did it in because I think I remember specifically when I was working at my last company in Singapore that we did have a trial with Envision Studio,
Yeah.
but Sketch was the one that was a more affordable,
Yeah.
and the engineers actually preferred using that over InVision because it was like easy to access, not files, but easy to understand, like the pixels and whatnot. InVision, for whatever reason, didn't fill out all the details and the things that what engineers wanted, right?
Yeah.
Which is weird if you think about it. You had it, you they built up to that point in 2017, but because there are other competitors that just kept leveling up, I think
Yeah.
they, for whatever reason, around 2017, 2018, they just vanished, like from
Yeah.
like companies just because of those plans and
I know.
whatnot.
Yeah. If I remember correctly, I never actually used InVision Studio because it was just so buggy. Like
Yeah, that
I,
too.
I was like, there's no way
Mm.
we would even think about moving things over. I think it's a really interesting sort of case study on like path of least resistance. Yes, I would rather sync through two different things than what we went to when we went through earlier, like moving all of my files over
Dude.
and changing
Yeah.
all of my process. And they did dark mode on it, and I don't think we needed that at the time. It was just like,
No.
it just felt like it was very off the mark.
It was too superfluous with all like all these weird features that you wouldn't use, but now
Yeah.
you're like, oh yeah, that would be great. I think
Yeah.
they were just too ahead of their time, which is
Yeah.
really sad if you actually think about it, because they actually knew where the industry was going. They were just too
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. It was interesting, man. I think in hindsight, definitely was a huge miss. Like I never got the vision of Envision of Studio because I just never had a great experience with it. And on top of that, they never really updated their core product. Like I know for a while they
No.
were always teasing us about, hey, we're going to do this new update. You can have better file management, which is great, right? If I had a place to put my presentations, prototypes, maybe we could change the way that we're working, given it was so visual, free using freehand. But it just never made the light of day. But yet you always saw the investments on learning material on their podcast. They came out with another movie called Squads around like the different working models, right? With Spotify, and I think Atlassian was a part of the documentary.
Yeah.
And so that was all good. And but I'm like, yo, what's going on here? And I think by that time, folks really caught wind of Figma. And it's really unfortunate because that was like a good 3 to 4 years of like people waiting on them to make some product updates.
I think that was the issue. The fact that we gave so much feedback to, hey, this is what we need. And Sketch and Figma were fulfilling those needs around 2017, 2018. Even like the obscure ones like UX Pin was like another one
Mhm.
because people were more
Yes,
into design systems as well, right?
exactly.
And it's just like, why do we have to keep waiting? Because I remember specifically just working on the Envision Studio for a little bit. And I was like, this is not, I don't want to drag all my files here. I'm already on Sketch. The company uses all Sketch. And there's only like maybe 4 or 5 people just using Envision Studio. It's not worth it, which is
Yeah.
sad.
Yeah. It's really sad. So, you fast forward to 2023, and basically a press release comes out that they get acquired, or Freehand gets acquired
What?
by Miro, which is like really ironic because I never opened up Freehand for the life of me. And if you look at their roadmap, like ton of articles around it, right? Like they've made a ton of updates. So they basically abandoned Envision,
That's
right?
crazy.
The whole thing was like,
Yeah.
we've got 2 million users that use Envision, but you basically only saw them making updates to Freehand. And I think what's also really interesting is if you actually go on their website, it's Envision, the makers of Freehand.
What? No
Complete
way.
pivot, right? Like
I, I get,
it's so
wow.
interesting. It's yeah, man. That's like the life and times. It's just fascinating that they moved into Miro, which I actually probably ended up using Miro a lot more than freehand. But I think like even now, FigJam is probably the place that we tend to do some more of like the brainstorming work. But yeah, it's interesting, man. I think what are some lessons you think you'd probably take away from this?
First off, I just went to the site and I'm just like shocked that they're like promoting freehand.
Yeah,
And that's not even their primary product that I remember. So
yeah,
it's just you talked about marketing budget and great marketing. Like this is poor marketing. Like
yeah.
where did it go wrong in terms of marketing and communication? Because I
Mm,
remember talking to evangelists and they were great. I remember they were just very communicative. They were always emailing me, always checking in on the design studios using their product. But like where did that go wrong? I think just in terms of communication,
yeah,
like you said, like just like waiting for that update. Like you're not gonna keep your users if you keep telling them you're gonna improve your product over the next 2, 3 years when there's other tools that are advancing at a faster pace. So it's just like communication,
yeah,
marketing, but also like delivering, right? Delivering on your
yeah,
actual user needs, which is really sad that they
yeah,
didn't.
yeah. I think they incrementally could have delivered on it. I don't think they needed to go for a big
Yeah.
swing. And I think their bread and butter was delivering incrementally on the things that really matter. And perhaps they probably lost sight of it. I don't know.
I think their product people got cold feet,
Yeah,
to be honest,
for sure.
right?
Yeah.
Too scared of disrupting their
Yeah.
moneymaker in general.
Yeah. Which is interesting because that's how they came in.
I don't understand I would like to be a fly on the wall of
Yeah.
those conversations with like head of product, marketing, business, and design
Yeah.
of like, why can't we just deliver on our promise to just update it right away instead of just like waiting for this studio thing to come out and it's
Yeah.
buggy as hell.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I had a really good time reflecting on this. Yeah, it's fun. I obviously learned a little bit about that, about like this whole path, like on the business side, doing research around it. But I'm sure most folks that at least have worked on the tool can probably resonate with our experiences over the time.
I hope ex InVision designers don't come after us because of this.
Look,
We're not
I'm sure.
trashing you guys. We love the
No,
product, right?
I don't
This,
think. No, we're
yeah,
users, right? Like
yeah.
I will say that I don't think I've come across a person at Envision that wasn't passionate about the vision of the product. And I think sometimes business decisions counter that. And I think that's just the reality of being in a very competitive market.
But that's the one thing that we should have probably talked about. Like the market from like when InVision first came out was like nothing until 2017,
Exactly.
2018, right?
I know.
And
I
that's
know.
what killed them, which is really sad.
Yep. Yeah, man. All right. Jay, thanks so much for tuning in. I know it's 4:40 in the morning where you're at. You're in the future.
I'm in the future.
When
Future is
7,
actually pretty dark.
I'm going to say technically when this gets released, you'll hear it first. That concludes the show. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. That is a huge way to show your support, and it really helps us reach more people and grow our following. By the way, we release a new episode every 2 weeks, but in the meantime, you can follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, or YouTube at Technically Speaking HW. Again, thanks so much, and I'll see you next time. This has been a production of Technically Speaking Media.